You're standing in the opulent Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in the year 1700, watching as Europe's most powerful monarchs gather for what should be a celebration of dynastic triumph. The air is thick with perfume and political intrigue, crystal chandeliers casting dancing shadows across faces that should represent the pinnacle of royal breeding and sophistication. But as you look closer at these assembled kings and queens, something deeply unsettling becomes apparent. The Spanish king can barely hold his head upright, his massive jaw hanging open in a way that makes speech nearly impossible. The French dauphin twitches uncontrollably, his eyes darting about as if seeing enemies that exist only in his fractured mind. An Austrian archduchess sits rigidly in her chair, her spine so curved that breathing seems to cause her visible pain. These aren't just the minor eccentricities of royal privilege. These are the walking, breathing consequences of a genetic catastrophe that has been building for centuries. What you're witnessing is the end result of the Bourbon dynasty's obsession with keeping their bloodlines pure. An obsession that would ultimately drive not just individual monarchs to madness, but entire nations toward revolution and collapse. The very people entrusted with governing millions had become so genetically compromised that they could barely govern themselves. Before diving into these forgotten stories of royal madness and genetic catastrophe, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters of European history together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with how power corrupts and dynasties fall. The Bourbon family rose to prominence in medieval France, but their path to continental dominance began with a simple yet catastrophic decision made in the 16th century. Unlike other European dynasties that occasionally married outside their immediate circles, the Bourbons became convinced that their royal blood was so superior, so divinely blessed, that diluting it with outside genetic material would be tantamount to treason against God himself. This wasn't mere vanity. In their minds, royal blood carried literal magical properties. They believed their bloodline contained a divine essence that gave them the right to rule over millions of subjects. To marry a commoner or even a minor noble would weaken this sacred inheritance and potentially doom their kingdoms to inferior leadership. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand with the primitive medical knowledge of their era, was that they were creating a genetic time bomb that would eventually destroy everything they sought to protect. The mathematics of inbreeding are brutally simple, though the consequences take generations to fully manifest. When cousins marry cousins repeatedly across multiple generations, harmful recessive genes that would normally be suppressed by genetic diversity begin to compound and intensify. Each generation becomes more likely to express devastating genetic disorders while simultaneously becoming less capable of producing healthy offspring. But the Bourbons weren't content with occasional cousin marriages. They turned inbreeding into an art form, a carefully orchestrated system of genetic concentration that would make modern geneticists recoil in horror. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces, and the family tree began to resemble not a branching structure but a twisted vine choking itself in its own coils. The first signs of trouble appeared in the late 1600s with Charles II of Spain, known to history as Charles the Bewitched. His parents were uncle and niece, but that was just the beginning of his genetic nightmare. When geneticists finally analyzed his family tree in the 20th century, they discovered that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of children produced by full siblings. Charles was essentially the genetic equivalent of a brother and sister having a child, but the damage had been accumulating for generations before his birth. Charles couldn't chew solid food because his massive Habsburg jaw prevented his teeth from meeting properly. He couldn't speak clearly because his tongue was too large for his deformed mouth. He suffered from chronic seizures that left him unconscious for hours at a time. His legs were so weak that he couldn't walk unassisted until he was 4 years old, and even then he moved with a shambling gait that terrified courtiers who were forced to witness his daily struggles. But Charles's physical deformities were nothing compared to his mental incapacity. Court observers described him as having the intellectual capacity of a young child, unable to understand basic concepts of governance or even personal care. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally making incomprehensible sounds that his courtiers pretended to understand as royal pronouncements. The tragedy wasn't just personal. Charles was the king of Spain at the height of its global empire, responsible for governing territories that stretched from the Philippines to Peru. Millions of subjects depended on his leadership, but the man they looked to for guidance could barely feed himself. His inability to produce an heir despite two marriages would eventually plunge Europe into the War of Spanish Succession, a conflict that killed hundreds of thousands and reshaped the continental balance of power. Charles's death in 1700 marked the end of the Spanish Habsburg line. But the Bourbon obsession with genetic purity was just beginning to reach its most destructive phase. The French branch of the family, watching the Spanish catastrophe unfold, should have learned from this cautionary tale. Instead, they doubled down on their inbreeding practices, convinced that the Spanish problems were isolated incidents rather than inevitable consequences of their shared genetic strategy. Louis XIV, the son, king himself, had managed to avoid the worst genetic consequences through a combination of luck and the fact that his own parents were only distantly related. But he was determined to ensure that his descendants would embody the absolute pinnacle of royal bloodline purity. The marriages he arranged for his children and grandchildren were masterpieces of genetic concentration, carefully designed to eliminate any trace of non-royal DNA from future generations. The results were catastrophic in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until decades later. Louis XIV's great-grandson, who would become Louis XV, showed early signs of the psychological instability that would plague the later Bourbon monarchs. As a child, he was described as unusually nervous and prone to fits of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. His tutors noted that he had difficulty concentrating and often appeared to be listening to voices that no one else could hear. But the true horror of Bourbon inbreeding wouldn't reach its climax until the reign of Louis XVI, the king whose genetic incapacity would help trigger the French Revolution. Louis XVI wasn't just politically incompetent, he was literally incapable of functioning as a normal human being, let alone as the absolute monarch of Europe's most powerful nation. Court physicians' records, hidden in archives for centuries to protect royal dignity, reveal a man so genetically damaged that he could barely perform the most basic functions expected of a king. He suffered from a condition that modern doctors would recognize as severe social anxiety disorder, probably caused by neurological damage from generations of inbreeding. He couldn't make eye contact with his own ministers, would stutter uncontrollably during important meetings, and often fled from state functions when the pressure became too overwhelming. Even more devastating was his complete inability to consummate his marriage to Marie Antoinette for 7 years after their wedding. This wasn't just personal embarrassment, it was a political catastrophe that threatened the alliance with Austria and left France without a clear succession. The problem wasn't psychological but physical, the result of genetic abnormalities that made normal intimate relations impossible. Marie Antoinette, herself the product of Austrian Habsburg inbreeding, brought her own genetic baggage to the marriage. Her family tree was almost as tangled as her husband's, and she suffered from the anxiety disorders and mood swings that characterized her bloodline. The combination of two genetically compromised individuals trying to rule France during one of the most challenging periods in European history was a recipe for disaster. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Bourbon genetic decline was how it affected their decision-making capabilities during critical moments in history. These weren't just personal tragedies, they were political catastrophes that affected millions of people. When Louis XVI faced the mounting crisis that would become the French Revolution, his genetic incapacity to process complex information or make decisive choices under pressure directly contributed to the collapse of the entire system. Court observers noted that during crucial cabinet meetings, Louis XVI would often appear confused by basic concepts that any competent ruler should have understood intuitively. He would agree to contradictory policies in the same conversation, apparently unable to grasp how his decisions related to each other. When presented with urgent reports about social unrest or economic crisis, he would sometimes simply stare blankly at the documents, as if the words were written in a foreign language. This wasn't laziness or indifference. Modern analysis of his symptoms suggests Louis XVI suffered from what we would now recognize as severe cognitive impairment, probably caused by the same genetic factors that produced his physical abnormalities. The man responsible for governing 25 million French subjects had the intellectual capacity of someone with a serious developmental disability. The irony is almost too perfect to be real. The Bourbon dynasty's obsession with maintaining the purity of their superior bloodline had produced rulers who were inferior to their subjects in every measurable way. The divine right of kings, supposedly proven by their genetic superiority, had been revealed as a grotesque fraud, perpetrated by people who were barely functional human beings. As revolution erupted across France, the genetic chickens of Bourbon inbreeding were finally coming home to roost. But the story doesn't end with the fall of the French monarchy. The Bourbon obsession with genetic purity had spread to other royal houses across Europe, creating a continental network of genetically compromised rulers whose collective incapacity would reshape European history in ways that are still felt today. The Spanish Bourbons, Austrian Habsburgs, and various German principalities had all adopted similar inbreeding strategies, creating a European ruling class that was simultaneously the most powerful and least capable in human history. As we'll see, their genetic dysfunction wouldn't just destroy individual dynasties. It would trigger wars, revolutions, and social upheavals that would transform European civilization forever. The genetic catastrophe wasn't confined to France and Spain. Like a plague spreading through Europe's interconnected royal bloodlines, the Bourbon obsession with purity had infected nearly every major dynasty on the continent. The Austrian Habsburgs had been practicing similar genetic concentration for centuries, and by the 18th century, the marriage networks between these families had created what can only be described as a continental asylum, masquerading as a legitimate government. Consider the bizarre case of Ferdinand the Sporn of Austria, who inherited the throne in 1835. Court records describe a man so profoundly damaged by generations of inbreeding that he could barely speak in complete sentences. His jaw was so malformed that eating required the assistance of multiple servants, who had to cut his food into tiny pieces and feed him like a child. But Ferdinand wasn't just physically incapacitated. His mental state was so compromised that he would spend hours arranging and rearranging objects on his desk, counting them obsessively while ignoring urgent matters of state. During cabinet meetings, Ferdinand would often interrupt serious discussions about war or economic policy to announce nonsensical observations, such as commenting on the patterns made by sunlight on the wall, or asking why his ministers' shoes made sounds when they walked. His advisors learned to conduct the real business of government, while the emperor played with toy soldiers or stared out windows, occasionally nodding as if he understood the complex political discussions happening around him. The tragedy deepened when Ferdinand attempted to fulfill his royal duty of producing an heir. His marriage to Maria Anna of Savoy was arranged with the usual pomp and ceremony, but the genetic reality made consummation not just unlikely but medically dangerous. Court physicians documented Ferdinand's condition in clinical terms that barely masked their horror at what they were witnessing. The emperor's reproductive anatomy had been so distorted by generations of genetic damage that normal marital relations were physically impossible. Maria Anna, herself the product of carefully orchestrated inbreeding among Italian nobility, brought her own genetic complications to the marriage. She suffered from what palace doctors described as nervous attacks that would leave her paralyzed with terror for days at a time. Modern medical analysis suggests she was experiencing severe panic disorders, probably caused by the same neurological damage that affected her husband. The couple's attempts to produce an heir became a source of dark fascination for European courts. Detailed reports circulated among diplomats describing the elaborate mechanical devices that had been constructed to assist with their intimate relations. These contraptions, designed by the finest engineers in the Austrian Empire, were more reminiscent of medieval torture devices than marital aids. The very fact that such equipment was necessary revealed the extent to which royal bloodlines had departed from normal human biology. But Ferdinand and Maria Anna's personal tragedy was just one example of a continent-wide phenomenon. The German principalities, connected to both the Austrian and French royal houses through centuries of intermarriage, were producing their own gallery of genetically compromised rulers. The Elector of Saxony could only communicate through grunts and gestures, having been born with a speech impediment so severe that his own courtiers required interpreters to understand his wishes. The Duke of Brunswick suffered from seizures so violent that he had to be restrained during attacks to prevent him from injuring himself or others. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the King of Naples, whose condition was so shocking that foreign ambassadors were warned in advance about what they would encounter during audiences. This monarch, whose name has been deliberately obscured in most historical records to protect royal dignity, exhibited symptoms that modern doctors would recognize as severe autism, combined with possible schizophrenia. He would rock back and forth during state ceremonies, making repetitive sounds that bore no resemblance to human speech, while his ministers conducted the actual business of government around him, like actors performing a play for an audience of one. The international implications of this genetic catastrophe became apparent during major diplomatic negotiations of the 18th century. Treaties that should have been straightforward agreements between rational actors became surreal exercises in managing the psychological limitations of genetically damaged rulers. Ambassadors learned to bring picture books and simple diagrams to explain complex political concepts, much as one might communicate with young children. The War of Austrian Succession, which raged across Europe from 1740 to 1748, was partly caused by the inability of various royal heirs to understand the legal implications of inheritance laws. What should have been a routine succession became a continental conflict because the genetically compromised rulers literally could not comprehend the documentation that determined their own legitimacy. Hundreds of thousands died in battles fought over succession rights that the supposed heirs themselves were incapable of understanding. Meanwhile, the psychological effects of genetic damage were manifesting in increasingly bizarre behavior among European royalty. The Portuguese royal family had developed a collective obsession with religious relics that bordered on madness. King John V spent the equivalent of millions of modern dollars acquiring pieces of saints' bones, fragments of the true cross, and other supposed holy artifacts, which he believed could cure the genetic curses that plagued his bloodline. His palace became a grotesque museum of religious paraphernalia, with rooms dedicated to displaying thousands of relics arranged according to mystical principles that existed only in the king's damaged mind. John would spend entire days praying before these displays, begging for divine intervention to restore his family's genetic health, while ignoring the practical business of governing his empire. His subjects in Brazil and other Portuguese colonies suffered under neglect and mismanagement, while their king pursued magical solutions to scientific problems. The Russian connection to this genetic disaster came through the marriage networks that linked the Romanov dynasty to Western European royal houses. Empress Elizabeth of Russia, daughter of Peter the Great, had managed to avoid the worst genetic consequences through her father's relatively healthy bloodline. But her successors weren't so fortunate. The marriage of her nephew Peter III to Catherine of Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg brought German genetic problems into the Russian imperial line. Peter III exhibited the classic symptoms of royal genetic damage from his earliest years. He was described by contemporaries as having an almost supernatural ability to make the worst possible decision in any given situation, not through malice but through what appears to have been genuine cognitive impairment. His 6-month reign was a masterclass in how genetic damage could translate directly into political catastrophe. Catherine, who would later become Catherine the Great, was horrified by her husband's mental state and the implications for their future children. Her private letters, discovered centuries later, reveal a woman desperately trying to navigate marriage to a man whose psychological condition made normal relationships impossible. She described Peter as being like a child who had been given adult responsibilities he could never understand, let alone fulfill. The coup that brought Catherine to power wasn't just a political revolution. It was a desperate attempt to prevent genetically damaged rulers from destroying one of Europe's great empires. Catherine's decision to have Peter III killed, while shocking by modern standards, can be understood as a form of genetic intervention designed to protect Russia from the kind of royal madness that was consuming Western Europe. But even Catherine's brilliant reign couldn't completely escape the genetic web that entangled European royalty. Her son, Paul III, showed clear signs of the psychological instability that characterized his father's bloodline. Paul's paranoia reached levels that would be considered clinical by modern standards. He became convinced that his own palace guards were plotting against him, that his food was being poisoned, and that foreign agents were hiding in the walls of his residence. Paul's reign became a 4-year nightmare of arbitrary executions, sudden policy reversals, and increasingly bizarre royal decrees. He banned certain styles of clothing because he believed they were coded messages from revolutionary agents. He required all citizens to prostrate themselves when his carriage passed, not out of traditional respect, but because he was convinced that failure to show proper deference was evidence of treasonous intent. The assassination of Paul I in 1801 was carried out not by foreign enemies, but by his own courtiers, who had concluded that the emperor's genetic madness posed an existential threat to the Russian Empire. The conspiracy included some of Russia's most loyal nobles, men who had served the crown faithfully for decades but could no longer tolerate watching their nation being destroyed by a ruler whose damaged mind made rational governance impossible. Back in Western Europe, the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding were becoming impossible to hide from increasingly educated populations. The Enlightenment had introduced new ideas about human equality and rational government that made the obvious incapacity of hereditary rulers seem like a cosmic joke. Philosophers like Voltaire and Rousseau wrote scathingly about the absurdity of systems that placed genetically damaged individuals in positions of absolute authority over millions of healthy, capable subjects. The contrast between royal genetic decay and the intellectual flowering of the Enlightenment created a cognitive dissonance that would ultimately prove revolutionary. How could societies that were producing brilliant scientists, artists, and philosophers continue to accept governance by rulers who were barely functional human beings? The divine right of kings became increasingly difficult to defend when the kings in question were obviously inferior to their subjects in every measurable capacity. The genetic crisis was also having practical effects on European military capabilities. Armies led by commanders whose judgment was compromised by neurological damage suffered defeat after defeat against forces led by competent generals. The Battle of Minden in 1759 saw Prussian forces, led by officers selected for merit rather than bloodline, decisively defeat a French army commanded by nobles whose genetic heritage had left them incapable of basic tactical thinking. These military failures weren't just embarrassing, they were existentially threatening to the entire system of hereditary monarchy. If royal bloodlines couldn't even produce competent military leaders, what justification remained for their privileged position? The genetic chickens were coming home to roost across multiple battlefields, and the results were reshaping the balance of power in ways that would have profound consequences for European civilization. The French court at Versailles had become a theater of genetic horror, masquerading as divine majesty. Foreign diplomats arriving for their first audience with Louis XV would often struggle to maintain their composure when confronted with the reality of Bourbon decay. The king would sit motionless for long periods during meetings, his eyes unfocused and glassy, occasionally making jerky movements with his hands that served no apparent purpose. When he did speak, his words often bore no relation to the topic being discussed, as if his damaged brain was processing conversations from entirely different contexts. What made the situation even more surreal was the elaborate court protocol that continued to treat these obvious symptoms of genetic damage as expressions of royal wisdom. When Louis XV would suddenly stand up in the middle of a diplomatic negotiation and begin arranging objects on a nearby table, his ministers would nod sagely and suggest that His Majesty was demonstrating the importance of order in international relations. When he would stare at a wall for 20 minutes without blinking, courtiers would whisper that the king was contemplating profound matters of state that mere mortals couldn't comprehend. The Marquise de Pompadour, Louis XV's most famous mistress, left behind private letters that reveal the heartbreaking reality of life with a genetically compromised monarch. She described having to essentially manage a man-child whose mood swings and cognitive limitations made normal relationships impossible. One day, he would shower her with expensive gifts and proclamations of eternal love. The next, he would forget who she was entirely, staring at her with the confused expression of someone trying to remember where they had seen a stranger's face. But perhaps most disturbing were Pompadour's descriptions of Louis XV's attempts to govern France during moments of crisis. When presented with reports of military defeats or economic disasters, the king would often respond by asking irrelevant questions about the physical appearance of the messengers or becoming fixated on minor details while ignoring the substance of the crisis entirely. During one particularly urgent cabinet meeting about a potential invasion by Austrian forces, Louis XV spent the entire session asking repeatedly why the maps were drawn with different colored inks, apparently unable to process the strategic information they contained. The genetic damage wasn't limited to cognitive impairment. Court physicians documented a range of physical abnormalities that made normal royal functions increasingly difficult. Louis XV's hands shook so violently that he couldn't sign documents without assistance. His speech was often slurred and difficult to understand, leading to miscommunications that had serious diplomatic consequences. Most embarrassingly, he suffered from a condition that caused him to drool constantly, requiring servants to discreetly wipe his chin during public appearances. These physical symptoms became so pronounced that special protocols had to be developed to manage royal appearances. Servants were trained to stand at strategic positions where they could quickly intervene if the king began exhibiting obvious signs of his condition. Diplomatic ceremonies were shortened to minimize the risk of embarrassing incidents, and foreign ambassadors were briefed in advance about the king's limitations to prevent awkward misunderstandings. The situation reached its nadir during the 7 Years' War, when France desperately needed strong leadership to coordinate its global military efforts against Britain and Prussia. Instead, the nation found itself led by a king whose genetic damage made him incapable of understanding basic military concepts. Louis XV would approve contradictory orders in the same day, apparently forgetting previous decisions within hours of making them. He once famously ordered the same regiment to march to 3 different locations simultaneously, then became agitated when his generals tried to explain why this was impossible. The war's disastrous outcome for France wasn't just the result of British naval superiority or Prussian military innovation. It was directly attributable to having a commander-in-chief whose brain was so damaged by generations of inbreeding that he couldn't maintain focus long enough to develop coherent strategies. French armies in North America, India, and Europe found themselves operating without clear objectives or consistent support, because their ultimate leader was literally incapable of providing either. The financial consequences of royal genetic incompetence were equally devastating. Louis XV's inability to understand basic economic concepts led to a series of fiscal disasters that would eventually bankrupt the French monarchy. He would approve massive expenditures for projects he found personally interesting, while ignoring urgent infrastructure needs that any competent ruler would have prioritized. His fascination with mechanical toys led to the crown spending enormous sums on elaborate clockwork devices, while French roads crumbled and bridges collapsed from neglect. The king's damaged judgment also made him easy prey for court favorites, who recognized his cognitive limitations and exploited them for personal gain. The Duke of Choiseul, one of Louis XV's most influential ministers, essentially governed France for nearly a decade by learning to manipulate the king's attention span and memory problems. Choiseul would present the same proposal multiple times, each time as if it were a new idea, until the confused monarch eventually approved it out of exhaustion rather than understanding. This manipulation extended to financial matters, with various courtiers convincing the king to grant them pensions, estates, and privileges that drained the royal treasury. Louis XV's genetic damage made him incapable of tracking these commitments or understanding their cumulative impact on French finances. He would sign documents creating new sources of royal income, while simultaneously authorizing expenditures that exceeded those revenues by enormous margins, apparently unable to grasp the mathematical relationship between the two. Meanwhile, across the border in Spain, the Bourbon genetic disaster was reaching even more catastrophic proportions. Philip V, the first Bourbon king of Spain, had inherited both the Spanish throne and the full complement of genetic abnormalities that characterized his bloodline. His condition was so severe that he spent the last 15 years of his reign convinced that he was already dead, a delusion that made governing one of the world's largest empires somewhat challenging. Philip's daily routine became a grotesque parody of royal life. He would hold court while insisting that all participants speak in whispers because loud noises disturb the dead. He refused to change his clothes for months at a time, explaining to horrified courtiers that corpses had no need for fresh garments. Most bizarrely, he would conduct state business while lying motionless in bed with his eyes closed, claiming that this was the proper position for deceased monarchs to receive petitions from their living subjects. The Spanish court adapted to their king's delusion with the same elaborate pretense that characterized royal protocol throughout Europe. Ministers learned to present policy proposals as communications from the living world to the realm of the dead. Foreign ambassadors were instructed to approach the king's bed with the reverent manner appropriate when addressing a holy relic. The entire apparatus of Spanish government continued to function around a ruler who believed he was a corpse, a situation that would have been comedic if it hadn't been so tragic for the millions of subjects depending on his leadership. Philip's wife, Elizabeth Farnese, found herself in the impossible position of trying to maintain some semblance of normal governance while managing a husband whose grip on reality had completely dissolved. Her private correspondence reveals a woman driven nearly to madness herself by the strain of pretending that her spouse's obvious insanity was merely an eccentric expression of royal wisdom. She described having to conduct diplomatic negotiations through a man who would interrupt serious discussions to ask why the furniture was floating, or to demand that ministers explain why they were glowing with supernatural light. The genetic damage wasn't limited to mental symptoms. Philip suffered from a skin condition that caused him to scratch constantly, often drawing blood and leaving permanent scars. His joints were so malformed that walking became increasingly painful, eventually requiring him to be carried everywhere in a specially designed chair. Most disturbing of all, he developed a compulsive behavior that involved pulling out his own hair, leaving him with bald patches that had to be concealed with elaborate wigs during public appearances. These physical symptoms combined with his psychological delusions to create a ruler who was barely recognizable as human, let alone as the divinely appointed leader of a global empire. Spanish colonies in the Americas began operating with increasing independence simply because communication with Madrid had become so unreliable. Colonial governors would send reports and requests that might or might not receive coherent responses, depending on Philip's mental state on any given day. The situation in Portugal was even worse, if such a thing was possible. King John V's obsession with religious relics had evolved into a full-blown psychosis that consumed every aspect of his reign. He became convinced that saints were speaking to him directly through their preserved body parts, providing divine guidance for governing his kingdom. The royal palace became a maze of shrines and altars where the king would spend days at a time conducting conversations with dead religious figures while his empire crumbled around him. John's genetic damage manifested in particularly disturbing ways during religious ceremonies. He would often begin laughing uncontrollably during Mass, apparently hearing jokes that the saints were telling him telepathically. Sometimes he would interrupt prayers to announce revelations that made no sense to anyone else present, such as declaring that St. Anthony had instructed him to paint all the horses in Lisbon blue, or that St. Francis wanted the royal treasury to purchase every mirror in Europe. The Portuguese court's attempts to manage their king's condition led to increasingly elaborate deceptions. Ministers learned to present policy proposals as divine commandments from various saints, carefully choosing religious figures they knew John favored for different types of decisions. Military matters were attributed to St. James, financial policies came from St. Matthew, and diplomatic issues were supposedly revealed by St. Thomas. The entire government of Portugal began operating as a bizarre religious theater designed to work around one man's genetic madness. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of the Portuguese situation was how it affected the colonies. Brazil, Portugal's most valuable overseas territory, suffered under policies that reflected John's damaged judgment rather than rational economic planning. He would issue contradictory orders based on supposed divine revelations, sometimes commanding the same colonial officials to implement opposite policies within days of each other. Brazilian governors learned to ignore most royal communications, implementing whatever seemed most practical while sending back reports crafted to satisfy whatever religious delusion currently dominated the king's attention. The cumulative effect of these genetically compromised rulers was a gradual collapse of effective governance across much of Europe. Kingdoms that had once been efficiently administered began experiencing the kind of chaos and dysfunction typically associated with failed states. Tax collection became irregular as confused monarchs forgot what they had authorized or approved. Conflicting exemptions for the same taxpayers. Military units found themselves without clear orders or adequate supplies as royal attention wandered from crisis to crisis without resolution. Trade suffered as merchants discovered that commercial agreements signed by genetically damaged rulers might be forgotten, reversed, or modified without warning. The predictability that successful commerce requires became impossible when the ultimate authority in each kingdom was exercised by individuals whose damaged brains made consistent decision-making impossible. European economic development began to lag behind other regions of the world, where leadership was based on competence rather than hereditary genetic lottery. The social contract between rulers and subjects, already strained by centuries of absolute monarchy, began to fracture completely as populations witnessed the obvious incapacity of their supposed betters. Peasants working in fields could see that they possessed more practical intelligence than the kings who claimed divine authority over their lives. Merchants conducting successful businesses understood economic principles better than the monarchs, who supposedly controlled national commerce. The entire ideological foundation of hereditary monarchy was being undermined by the visible evidence of royal genetic failure. Enlightenment philosophers seized on this contradiction with devastating effectiveness. Voltaire's satirical writings about European courts weren't just witty entertainment. They were systematic demolitions of the entire concept of hereditary rule based on genetic superiority. When the supposedly superior bloodlines were producing rulers who were obviously inferior to average citizens in every capacity that mattered, the philosophical justification for monarchy collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. The stage was being set for revolutionary upheaval that would sweep away not just individual dynasties, but the entire system of hereditary rule that had dominated Europe for centuries. The Bourbon obsession with genetic purity had created the conditions for its own destruction, producing rulers so incompetent that their subjects would eventually conclude that any alternative had to be better than the genetic nightmare that was consuming European civilization from within. The revolutionary fires that would consume European monarchy were already smoldering by the 1780s, but the final spark came from an unlikely source: the genetic inability of France's royal family to comprehend the gravity of their situation. As bread riots erupted in Paris and provincial assemblies demanded reform, Louis XVI sat in his palace at Versailles, literally incapable of processing the information his ministers desperately tried to convey. Court records from this period, preserved in the French National Archives, reveal a monarch whose genetic damage made him fundamentally unsuited for the crisis consuming his kingdom. During crucial meetings about France's mounting debt crisis, Louis XVIII would become fixated on irrelevant details while ignoring the substance of financial reports. When his finance minister Jacques Necker presented detailed analyses of the kingdom's fiscal situation, the king would interrupt to ask about the color of the binding on the documents, or wonder aloud why numbers were written with ink instead of carved in stone. The Queen Marie Antoinette brought her own genetic baggage to this catastrophic situation. Her Habsburg bloodline carried the same neurological damage that had plagued her Austrian relatives for generations. She suffered from severe mood swings that could transform her from giddy euphoria to suicidal depression within hours. Palace servants learned to read the subtle signs that indicated which version of the queen they would encounter on any given day, adjusting their behavior accordingly to avoid triggering violent outbursts. But it was the combination of these two genetically compromised individuals trying to navigate the French Revolution that created one of history's most perfect storms of incompetence meeting crisis. As the Estates General convened in 1789 for the first time in over a century, France needed decisive leadership capable of implementing bold reforms to address centuries of accumulated problems. Instead, the nation found itself led by a king who couldn't maintain focus long enough to understand what the Third Estate was demanding, and a queen whose damaged judgment made her incapable of recognizing the mortal danger surrounding their family. The famous incident of Marie Antoinette supposedly saying, let them eat cake. Probably never happened, but it perfectly captures the disconnect between royal genetic reality and popular perception. The Queen's actual recorded statements during this period reveal something far more disturbing than callous indifference. They show a woman whose brain damage made her literally incapable of understanding cause and effect relationships. When told that Parisians were rioting because they had no bread, she genuinely seemed confused about why this would make them angry, apparently unable to grasp the connection between hunger and civil unrest. Louis XVI's response to the growing crisis was equally revealing of his genetic limitations. When presented with the tennis court oath, where the Third Estate had sworn not to disband until France had a new constitution, the king's initial reaction was to ask why they were meeting in a building designed for sports. His ministers spent hours trying to explain the political significance of this act of defiance, but Louis remained fixated on the architectural details of the venue, apparently unable to process the revolutionary implications of what had occurred. The royal family's flight to Varennes in 1791 became a tragicomic demonstration of how genetic damage could transform what should have been a straightforward escape into a farce that sealed their doom. The plan itself was reasonable: flee Paris under cover of darkness and reach the safety of royalist forces on the Austrian border. But the execution revealed the profound cognitive limitations of its royal participants. Louis XVI insisted on bringing a massive traveling coach loaded with unnecessary luxuries, apparently unable to understand that successful escapes required speed and discretion rather than comfort and display. When disguises were prepared to help the family travel incognito, the king chose costumes that made him more conspicuous rather than less, selecting clothing and accessories that practically advertised his royal identity to anyone who saw him. Most damaging of all, Louis XVI couldn't resist stopping at inns along the route to enjoy elaborate meals, apparently forgetting that revolutionary authorities were searching for escaped royalty. His genetic damage had left him incapable of maintaining the focus and discipline that their desperate situation required. When they were inevitably captured and returned to Paris, the king seemed genuinely surprised that their leisurely journey had attracted attention, apparently unable to connect his own behavior with the failure of their escape attempt. The trial and execution of Louis XVII in 1793 marked more than just the end of a particular monarch. It represented the final collapse of the entire genetic experiment that had dominated European politics for centuries. The man who lost his head to the guillotine wasn't just a political enemy of the revolution, but a living symbol of how hereditary rule based on supposed genetic superiority had produced leaders who were inferior to their subjects in every capacity that mattered. But the revolutionary solution to royal genetic incompetence created its own set of problems. Napoleon Bonaparte, who emerged from the chaos to become Emperor of the French, represented a return to autocratic rule based on merit rather than heredity. His brilliant military campaigns and administrative reforms demonstrated what competent leadership could accomplish when freed from the constraints of genetic lottery. However, Napoleon's own attempts to establish a hereditary dynasty revealed how difficult it was to escape the European obsession with bloodline legitimacy. Despite his obvious superiority to the genetically damaged Bourbons he had replaced, Napoleon felt compelled to marry into established royal families to legitimize his new empire. His marriage to Marie-Louise of Austria brought Habsburg genetic problems back into French ruling circles, setting the stage for future difficulties. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy after Napoleon's defeat represented a triumph of genetic nostalgia over practical governance. Louis XVI, brother of the executed Louis XV, had spent decades in exile while his family's genetic damage continued to manifest in new and disturbing ways. The restored king suffered from severe obesity that left him barely able to walk, along with cognitive limitations that made effective rule nearly impossible. Charles VI, who succeeded his brother in 1824, exhibited the classic symptoms of Bourbon genetic decline in their most pronounced form. His paranoia reached levels that would be considered clinical by modern standards, leading him to see revolutionary conspiracies in the most innocent activities of his subjects. His inability to distinguish between legitimate political opposition and treasonous rebellion ultimately provoked the July Revolution of 1830, which drove the Bourbon family from the French throne for the final time. The genetic legacy of European royal inbreeding didn't end with political revolution. The psychological and physical damage accumulated over centuries of cousin marriages continued to manifest in the descendants of these dynasties long after they had lost their thrones. Deposed royal families scattered across Europe carried with them the genetic time bombs that their ancestors had so carefully constructed through generations of deliberate inbreeding. The Habsburg family, perhaps the most systematically inbred of all European dynasties, continued to produce genetically damaged offspring well into the 20th century. The last Habsburg emperor, Charles I of Austria, exhibited many of the same cognitive limitations that had characterized his predecessors, contributing to Austria-Hungary's catastrophic performance during World War I. His inability to understand modern military strategy or industrial economics helped ensure that his empire would be dismantled by more competent adversaries. The Spanish Bourbon Restoration of the 19th century brought genetically compromised rulers back to power, with predictably disastrous results. Isabella II, whose reign was marked by constant political instability and military defeat, suffered from the same psychological disorders that had plagued her bloodline for generations. Her inability to provide stable leadership contributed to Spain's decline from global power to European backwater, a fall that can be directly traced to centuries of royal genetic mismanagement. Perhaps most tragically, the genetic damage wasn't limited to ruling families themselves. The practice of royal inbreeding had created a broader European aristocracy that shared many of the same genetic problems as their monarchs. Noble families across the continent had participated in the same cousin marriage networks that produced genetically damaged rulers, creating an entire social class whose biological limitations made them unsuited for the leadership roles they claimed by birth. The Industrial Revolution and the rise of democratic governance finally provided alternatives to hereditary rule based on genetic lottery. Nations that embraced merit-based leadership and constitutional government began to outperform kingdoms still clinging to the fiction of royal genetic superiority. The economic and military advantages of competent governance became impossible to ignore as genetically damaged aristocrats found themselves consistently outmaneuvered by leaders chosen for their abilities rather than their bloodlines. The scientific revolution that accompanied these political changes also provided explanations for the genetic catastrophe that had consumed European royalty. Mendel's laws of inheritance, Darwin's theory of evolution, and advances in medical understanding revealed why inbreeding had produced such devastating results. The divine right of kings was replaced not just by democratic ideology, but by scientific knowledge that exposed hereditary monarchy as a biological impossibility. Modern genetic analysis of European royal bloodlines has confirmed what contemporary observers suspected but couldn't prove: that centuries of systematic inbreeding had created genetic disasters of unprecedented scope. The Habsburg jaw, Bourbon madness, and countless other royal abnormalities were not divine mysteries or unfortunate accidents, but inevitable consequences of breeding practices that violated the most basic principles of genetics. The story of how inbred Bourbon kings drove Europe to madness serves as one of history's most perfect cautionary tales about the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of people chosen by genetic accident rather than demonstrated competence. The divine right of kings, justified by supposed genetic superiority, ultimately produced rulers who were genetically inferior to their subjects in every measurable way. But perhaps the most important lesson of this genetic catastrophe is how it demonstrates the resilience of human societies when freed from the constraints of hereditary incompetence. The same European nations that had stagnated under genetically damaged monarchs experienced unprecedented growth and achievement once leadership was based on merit rather than bloodline. The contrast between royal genetic failure and post-revolutionary success reveals the enormous human potential that had been suppressed by centuries of dynastic misrule. The marble halls of Versailles still echo with the footsteps of those genetically compromised monarchs, their portraits still hanging in galleries where tourists marvel at the artistic achievements of an age they don't fully understand. But behind the beauty and grandeur of royal palaces lies a darker truth about the price of genetic hubris and the ultimate triumph of human competence over hereditary delusion. The Bourbon obsession with keeping their bloodlines pure had achieved exactly the opposite of what they intended. Instead of creating superior rulers worthy of divine authority, they had produced a dynasty of genetic failures whose incompetence would ultimately destroy not just their own family, but the entire system of hereditary monarchy that had dominated European civilization for over 1,000 years. In trying to preserve their genetic legacy, they had ensured its extinction, leaving behind only the lesson that true nobility lies not in the accident of birth, but in the cultivation of wisdom, compassion, and competence that any human being can achieve regardless of their bloodline.